Hey, it's John, and welcome to the interview. Today, I am joined by Blaine Bartlett, who is the CEO of Avatar Resources, a global leadership development and consulting firm, which he founded all the way back in 1987. So he's been doing this a little while. Blaine has coached and consulted worldwide with executives, companies, and governments, and has personally delivered programs to more than 250,000 individuals and has impacted more than 1 million people with his philosophies worldwide. He is the #1 best-selling international author of Compassionate Capitalism, a topic we're going to be talking about today. And he's co-written and collaborated with the likes of Stephen Covey, Blanchard, Brian Tracy, and a number of other top leaders in the leadership and business development fields. So we're blessed to have Blaine here today. Blaine, thanks so much for stopping by.
John, my absolute pleasure. Hey. Yeah, I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, and Blaine and I have had a couple of conversations recently. So excited to let you all kind of listen into. He's just a brilliant resource. Just give people the Reader's Digest version of your story, just to kind of let the listeners get a little bit of your background, Blaine.
Okay, well, yeah, very simple. I mean, I grew up on a farm. I'll just start with that. And I mention that because nature has always been, for me, the greatest teacher I've ever had. And I look at nature and just the cyclical dynamic that is present in nature. There's seasons, obviously, but also the symbiosis, the way that everything just kind of supports everything else. That is it's a system that's interlocked, and that when that starts to get perturbed and when it starts to get damaged, literally all bets are off. So I transfer that into the organization work that I do, and organizations are part of an ecosystem. They're part of a very large system. So we'll talk about that in just a minute. But I used my experience growing up on a farm as a way to begin to answer some questions that I was really curious about. Some of which were really fundamental. Why do organizations work or not work? And what seems to be the secret sauce, if there's a secret sauce, to sustainability? I got very interested in that pretty early on, and then I got involved in the human potential movement back in the 70s as a way to look at how individuals impact these organizational systems. What is it that I bring to the table? And that led to me moving into the consulting world, and I founded a couple of businesses, and then ended up working in Asia for about 5 years, ran what ended up becoming the largest HR consulting firm in Asia. We did that out of Japan at that point in time. And then it just kind of matriculated from there. Did a lot of work in Europe, led Nokia's Global Leadership Initiative, or a portion of that Global Leadership Initiative, helped develop and lead that for about 12 years as an external consultant, which really got me involved in large-scale enterprises, just looking at what's the leadership function in these multinational organizations. And since then, I've done work in literally every continent on the planet except Antarctica. Penguins don't necessarily need what I'm offering, I think.
Penguin Publishing Group down in Antarctica or something, huh? They need your help, Blaine. Come on, you got to get on a plane.
So that's kind of the Cliff Note version. I'm a grandfather, very happily married to an incredible woman who started a foundation. We do a fair amount of work in India and Africa as a consequence of her initiatives. And so the social enterprise piece of that conversation comes into my work as well. So
yeah,
that's where we're at.
Very cool. So you've done a lot of cool stuff, seen a lot of countries, traveled around the world. I guess this might be a tough question. I'll throw it out there. We'll see where it goes. So after all of that experience, like what do you think was your biggest takeaway so far along your journey, as far as like leadership, or it could be what you've seen in companies or in your own life journey?
That's a great question. I think the single biggest takeaway, and it's a question that I continue to get, is I work in all of these different cultural in difference, in different cultural areas or areas where there are different cultures, both linguistic, but also national cultures, ethnic cultures, that sort of thing. Is there a difference? Particularly when it comes to the application and deployment of quote unquote leadership. And what I found and continue to find is that there is really no difference. Yes, there's artifacts of culture and whatnot that kind of need to be paid attention to, but fundamentally, people are the same. People are people. They want to feel valued. They want to feel as if they're seen and understood. All of these, very fundamental human needs are present in every organization I've ever worked in, no matter where they are on the planet. And it's just a matter of kind of fine tuning the message so that that need is actually addressed as we work. And that's where the compassion piece came in and was part of the spark that created the book that you referenced, Compassionate Capitalism.
So what are some ways that leaders can implement more compassion and because you're right. I mean, deep down, humans may look different. They may have some differences, but at their deep subconscious, soulful core, we all are fairly similar, right? We all desire certain things, that Maslow talks about this in his hierarchy and, different things like that. But, is there any correlation there? Like, how can leaders install more compassion throughout their organizations?
Yeah, again, John, I love the questions. Compassion, first of all, I want to disabuse any of our listeners from a notion that sometimes creeps in here. Compassion is not soft and warm and fuzzy. Yeah, compassion is all about connection.
Yeah.
Now, it can be soft and warm and fuzzy, but it's not to be confused with empathy, as an example here. Yeah, compassion is a behavior that recognizes that everybody is connected in some way to everything else that goes on around them. There's a connection. There's a fundamental core connection. So as a leader in an organization, one of the key questions that I can ask of the people that I'm working with is I ask them to work towards the goals and initiatives of the company is, if we're successful in doing this, what does it make possible for you that you value, that you wouldn't get anywhere else? You get it by working with us. What might that be? Now, I guarantee that most people have never been asked that question. They've never even been asked to consider that question. But if you look at employee engagement scores globally, 87%, according to Gallup, of the workforce globally is disenfranchised or disconnected or emotionally unengaged, I should say. And that number hasn't changed in about 20 years that Gallup's been doing these surveys. It's moved a percentage point one way or the other, but fundamentally it's about 87, 85% disengaged. Specifically because people aren't given an opportunity to identify a personal link, a personal connection to what they're being asked to at work. Yeah, they get a paycheck. Yeah, they get, that sort of stuff, but that's not the same. It's not the same. And when we get starting to move up Maslow's hierarchy of needs, people start looking at where's meaning. Why is it meaningful to do what I do? Beyond the monetary compensation. So that question, what do you get to have, do, or be as a consequence of doing the work with us that you wouldn't get someplace else? That's a big difference maker.
So just simply having a conversation with the employee then, or the team member, and is it really come down to fulfilling that need or placing them in the right positions for themselves so they can thrive? What does that look like?
Yeah, thriving is part of it. Not just merely surviving. If you look at a jungle, one of the aphorisms that I hear a lot is, be careful, it's a jungle out there. I would rather be in a jungle than in a desert. Quite frankly, jungles are symbiotic. Jungles thrive. Now, when you start looking at that, how do you actually navigate through a jungle? Well, the more familiar you are with it, the more you can actually navigate in a very healthy way through a quote unquote jungle, and actually have minimal risk in doing so. Thriving is an aspiration. People want to thrive. They want to grow. So the question that we're looking at here has to do with how do we position people to thrive in an organization? And if we're doing that, the organization is positioned to thrive. I mean, at the end of the day, all an organization is a collection of people in relationship. That's all it is, collection of people that are in relationship. And if the relationships are working well, the organization's got a pretty good shot at being successful. And that's not just the interpersonal relationships. That's the tip of the iceberg, and that's where most people go when I mention this. But it's relationship with values, it's relationship with vision and goal, relationship with chairs, relationship with work process. All of these things have a relational dynamic to them. And if the leaders are paying attention to the quality of these relationships, things start to hum. They're actually working fairly well at that point in time, and people are set up to thrive. Their voices start to get heard, and they feel seen and heard, which is a big deal.
Yeah. So, I mean, how does that look logistically then? I mean, because, let's say a company's got thousands of employees. You have a leader. Obviously, they need to have the characteristics of compassion, and there's certain characteristics that a leader starts with, right? I interviewed Gary Ridge of a WD-40 company, and he talks a lot about the soul-sucking CEO and people like that. So obviously, it starts at the top, and then you have kind of your team below you there. But I mean, logistically, like, how do you implement something like that? Is it just team building stuff, or is it just kind of over time permeate the culture?
Well, it is culture. It is culture. That's exactly what we're paying attention to here. You go back, Peter Drucker, culture will eat strategy for lunch. And then Mark Benioff said, no, that's actually, strategy's culture's going to eat strategy for breakfast. Things are moving that fast. Culture is pervasive, and culture is the water in which the fish swim. And if the culture is not healthy, you're not going to be working well. So the way that question gets addressed is it's a cascading sort of a process. You can have a CEO or a head of an organization that has an awareness around this and the viability of it. It needs to get cascaded down. And part of this is embedded in what's the compensation system, what's the reward structure. Are people compensated and rewarded for attending to these sorts of things in addition to traditional business metrics and outcomes? So it's not an either or, it's an and that is in many cases it is a cultural shift, because this isn't typically what organizations pay attention to, and it's not definitely what most managers and leaders are trained to pay attention to. And as a consequence, 40, I think the number is 40, and this is something that McKinsey cited. $43 billion a year is spent on leadership development with the intention of moving the needle on employee engagement. That needle hasn't moved in 20 years. We're paying attention to the wrong things in our leadership development process. We're not paying attention to what actually gets people engaged, which is the quality of the relationships that they're engaged with. Yeah. Do I have resources to do my job? Do I see that I can win and actually thrive in this environment? Which translates to I care about the outcomes. And so if I care, I'm going to be emotionally involved and emotionally engaged in what it is that I'm doing. And I'll bring stuff to the table. I'll have ideas. All of these sorts of things begin to percolate up when the dynamic of leadership begins to change, when it's attending to different things. Leadership causes movement, and the quality of that movement makes a difference. Is it movement away from something, or is it in movement towards something? Is it inclusive?
Yeah, it's interesting you talked about that. It seems like if people get kind of bored or they get stuck in a commodity, kind of as a cog in a commodity wheel, like they don't, if you ask them, what does your company stand for, or what is its bigger purpose, they'd probably be like, to make widgets, right? Or, and then they kind of get bored, right? Because financially they want to be taken care of. And I'm sure part of liking a company could be the compensation plan or the paid time off or just the work-life sort of integration that employees can experience. But a lot of it, as you pointed out, is going to be, is there something exciting or compelling, or is there a bigger mission or bigger purpose? And do they all know that they're part of something bigger than themselves? Because we all want to be a part of something bigger than ourselves, right? We don't want to just be kind of plodding along in a commodity sense. So
Exactly.
how important is that bigger vision, that everybody knows that, and how important is just having fun with your coworker? how
It's hugely important.
Different in those, and what are the differences? Because I imagine they're massive.
Oh, some of the companies that I work with that are absolutely off the charts in terms of thriving, as an example, they are fun to be around. I mean, they absolutely. I mean, you walk in and it just buzzes.
Right.
Again, I kind of go back to nature. When it's a healthy environment, things are growing. And the nature of life is expression. The nature of life is growth. And if people, and this is true in my experience, in most workplaces, there's a cap on people's experience of their ability to grow in their positions, their ability to grow in their organization. Mm-hmm. You start removing that cap, and you start getting imagination kicked in. And part of what I wrote about in Compassionate Capitalism, Journey to the Soul of Business, is the role of imagination. Imagination lives at the threshold of the soul, the spirit. I mean, and I don't mean this in a religious sense. I mean spirit in terms of the spirit of life. Right. Things have spirit, and when that's available, imagination begins to kick in. And this is where we see innovation. This is where we begin to see all kinds of stuff beginning to emerge. It's because people are having fun. Yeah. A great question is, and it revolves around the nature of love. And I don't mean, warm and fuzzy love, but it's what would you love to do? Do you get to do, or at least have access to what you like to do, love to do on a fairly regular basis at work? And this is one of the questions that Gallup asks in their employee engagement surveys. How frequently do you get to do what you love at work? And if the answer is never, all of a sudden you've got spirit disappearing. It becomes a have to, not a want to.
Right. And, it totally makes sense, right? Imagination, childhood fun, who doesn't want to go hang out with a bunch of fun people and have fun and, do something meaningful, right? Of course. I imagine you've seen have you seen some businesses where this is easier to implement than others? I mean, some where you're just flat in a cubicle and you have to grind out a bunch of code or something like that versus, maybe a more creative or open communicative job. I mean, how does a cubicle company kind of incorporate some of that fun or some of that stuff when there's just long hours that, quite frankly, you have to be hitting the keyboard or something like that?
Yeah. It's possible to do. Yeah. And this is, where you start addressing, the cultural artifact, because, I mean, getting up on the desk and Yahoo dancing around is not and it's not everybody's cup of tea. So fun can take on all kinds of different forms. I've worked a lot with engineers. I've worked in labs, and there are ways that people have fun. And oftentimes it is very specific to that particular domain. Do people have an opportunity to explore, to inquire, which is for them fun? It doesn't have to be, with pom-poms and everything else. It's more organized around what would you love to do? And that's where fun starts to creep in.
Yeah. Are you an advocate for like Google has their free time, 10% free range time or any of that kind of stuff? Are you an advocate for that?
I think it's a wonderful idea. I mean, I really do. There's something about disengaging the gears that allows for the flywheel, so to speak, I'm being metaphoric here, to just kind of unspool a little bit. And in that process, things begin to occur. When the mind is engaged in a chatter all the time, it's really difficult to hear, the ideas percolating. So I want to be able to disengage sometimes. I mean, for me, I'll just go for a walk in nature. And I'm fortunate enough to live in a place where I've got, land that I can actually walk on. And I just kind of go out and I just, not with any intent particularly, but I just want to free my mind up for a little bit. That free time is invaluable to me in terms of my experience of creativity.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not to mention
zooming out a little bit for sure. Let's broaden the conversation out to the second half of this and talk more about capitalism as a whole. I know you write about that, and you've had a lot of experience and behind the scenes of a lot of businesses, and you're part of Conscious Capitalism, which that's where you and I met earlier this year. What kind of shifts do you see in the current capitalist system that would move us in the right direction? Like, we talked a lot about it at the event, but this maybe for the listener who wasn't there, what are some of the shifts you see that are needed in the current system?
Yeah. Well, I think, first of all, I am an avowed capitalist. I think that it's the most effective economic model that has ever come across the horizon. And that being said, I think it's also gone off the rails in a very significant way. Some of the stuff that we're seeing around the world today in terms of income inequality, degradation of the environment. I mean, there's a number of different things that we can point to. Speak to the missing missing the mark on what capitalism was actually intended to produce. Now, Adam Smith didn't call this capitalism. He called it essentially the wealth of nations, that it was a function of mutual benefit out of trading. I scratch your back, you scratch mine. And this is a very truncated and abbreviated version of the wealth of nations philosophy, but it was about mutual benefit, enlightened self-interest. I'm interested in myself, but it's enlightened self-interest. It's not at the expense of my trading partner, because if you're being compromised, and trading partner I'm using in a very broad sense here, not just the individual trading partners that I would interact with or do business with, but also the ecosystem that I actually am trading within and trading with. The environment, I'm trading with the environment on an ongoing basis. If it's not benefiting as well as I'm benefiting, we're going to have some difficulty. And about 1950 or so, 1960, we started to go off the rails in a major way in terms of our execution of capitalism. And this is where Ayn Rand started to come in. Instead of enlightened self-interest, it was simply self-interest. How can I get mine? At the expense of, and that oftentimes went unexpressed, but at the expense of my trading partners. Milton Friedman famously saying that the only purpose of business is to make a profit, and that moved shareholders into the catbird seat. So there's all kinds of dynamics that started to happen. Where I see business going today is an awakening to the consequence of that. And it's not so much business as much as consumers of life going, wait a minute, something's off here. And for me, business is the most pervasive and most powerful influencer on the planet today. I mean, there's literally nothing that isn't touched by the activity of business. So when business begins to wake up to the fact that they have a moral responsibility for the quality of life, the quality of relationship on the planet, that's when things begin to shift again. And it's not personal self-interest, it's enlightened self-interest. I will benefit. I mean, the future of business is making the future its business. I mean, that really is fundamentally what it comes down to for me. The future of business is making the future its business. And if the future isn't healthy, business doesn't, we're not going to survive. And that's not apocalyptic. That's just a fact.
Yeah.
So that awareness is huge.
So what are some of the underlying ideology or the disease, so to speak, if you want to call it that, of why we've gone from more of a mutual benefit mindset to an accelerated one of like, I got to get mine kind of thing, particularly in a lot of the bigger companies?
There's a consciousness of scarcity, I think, that drives a lot of this. It's an abundant universe. I mean, it truly is an abundant universe. Now, that being said, when we start looking at what the consequence of some of our business activities are, it now takes 1 3/4 Earths to replenish the way that we're consuming resources on this planet today. We are not doing it in an intelligent way. What I mean by that, it literally will take the Earth. The Earth can't regenerate itself, from a resource standpoint, to continue funding, so to speak, our consumption, both from a production standpoint, but also the consumption of that production. Today, as we do this interview, it will take 1 3/4 Earth's resources to get us back to a baseline. So where that goes to is where that came from actually had to do with this thing of there's two things. Boy, I start going down all kinds of rabbit holes when I start thinking of this stuff. The economic model that we work with today is driven by consumption. It's not driven by value. It's driven by consumption. And it's a non-sustainable driver. We cannot continue to consume ever increasing quantities. So the way that gets addressed is to begin shifting towards a focus on what is real value. Do the consumers feel more alive? Do consumers feel more well, I'll just use the word. Do you feel more alive? Do you feel more inspired? Do you feel more awake, if you will, in the presence of this service or product than you would somebody else's service or product? That sense of aliveness speaks to a sense of connection. Not only am I connected to the service or product, but I'm connected to what it makes possible for me. Now, it's very subtle, but it begins to shift the nature of consumption. I start consuming with an eye towards value, towards aliveness. And that has a symbiotic, overflow. If I'm feeling more alive, I want to be sure that things around me are feeling more alive, including the environment, including the people that I'm working with. There's a spillover effect. Now, this gets to be, almost an abstraction, but if we're paying attention to this in a different way, there's an abundance of value that can be created in this, and it starts to move into creativity. We start getting, much more imaginative about how we deliver our service and our product, and even what our service or product is. All of these things start to come into play. And services and products, particularly products that are damaging, in some way, begin to be highlighted, and people will stop addressing them. They will stop taking them in. And again, we're kind of in an abstraction here, but this is where compassion begins to work. Compassion is the behavior that's associated with consciousness. Greater awareness about what's going on around me calls for different behaviors as a consequence of that awareness. Compassionate capitalism is a call towards behaving as if we are all connected in some way, that everything is connected in some way. And it's generated out of that awareness.
Yeah. Compassion, it seems like the enemy, or potentially the barrier for that, because you're right, is kind of the pervasive short-termism that is in all of our lives, both human psyche. There's a lot of people struggling. They got to get what they can get today kind of thing. So they don't have time for compassion in their minds. Also just, technology is all this short-term, now push button kind of thing. And then like Wall Street, for example, like the pressure on leaders of public companies to produce for shareholders and things like that. I mean, there's this, I think we talked about it a fair amount at the conference as well. Like this short-termism kind of disease is eroding away at a lot of the long-term benefit that people could be experiencing. But how do you get past that? Because it's like there's human nature, there's technology, there's regulation systems. I mean, there's a lot of things there.
Yeah, it's complex, and it truly is complex. I don't think that there's a silver bullet for it. And that being said, I think if there was a silver bullet, it would be awareness. And I go back to nature. Nature is not short-term in its view. Nature is, it recognizes that there's cycles, but it also is, if nature had a consciousness, it's a long-term consciousness. When we start looking at, the purpose of an organization is to make a profit, that imposes a short-term sensibility. It imposes a short-term behavioral driver. If we're looking at the purpose of the business, if it's a corporation, is to create value, which was essentially what corporations were designed to do in the beginning. If you go back to the 1700s, when the first chartering mechanisms came in for these, the Hudson Bay Company, these were the original corporations. They had a finite lifespan. They were not unlimited in their grant. These organizations had a finite lifespan, and they were to produce an outcome in that finite lifespan, so that there was a legacy that was going to be built on. Short-term greed is organized around accumulation. I need to get mine, and so this whole notion of accumulation is antithetical to nature. Nature doesn't accumulate; nature circulates. So, I keep going back to nature on this. The healthiest companies that I've ever associated with are ones that really see themselves as centers of distribution. They're centers of distribution in the sense that as capital comes in, it transforms itself into product and services that move out. It's not about accumulating revenue. It's not about accumulating wealth in that sense. Wealth is utilized. So it's in a continual flow. When we start damming the process up, we start changing the entire ecosystem, and people start looking at it and go, God, that's big. I want big.
Right.
When did big become a value? When did big become the overarching value? That's a crazy meme.
Yeah, and they call it currency for a reason, right? Kind of.
Yeah, exactly.
But I think is it just fear? Is it just our global anxiety and fear for scarcity that's driving this even more today, or selfishness? People seem to be getting more selfish as a population. Less what can I do for the country, more what can I do for me, and or what it can do for me, kind of thing.
You mentioned the word or used the phrase human nature. Human nature isn't as it's expressed today, as we typically will say, well, that's just human nature. I don't think that it is human nature. Human nature, if we go back to the roots, there's a symbiosis. You look at some of the tribes that are in the Amazonia basin and some of these other, human nature is actually fairly egalitarian. There is this symbiosis of distribution, of not hoarding, that sort of stuff that comes into play. We've learned to do this. And part of this has to do with a couple of contextual frames that I think people actually operate off of. And I think that there's three primary ones, economically, but also just in terms of how people live. It's a consciousness of there's not enough. And then that will drive a certain behavioral set. There's a consciousness of there's just enough. And that also has a little bit different flavor to it. And then there's a consciousness of there's more than enough. Very different context. And it's the thinking that makes the behavior. How I describe something determines how I feel about it, which drives the behavior. So when you talk about fear, fear is going to be organized around there's not enough or there's just barely enough. And fear is contractive. So it's going to be natural that hoarding starts to take into play. I got to get mine and I got to keep mine. If there's more than enough, which is actually factually true, there is more than enough. There's more than enough intelligence. There's more than enough energy. We aren't energy poor. We may be fossil fuel constrained, but that's not the same as energy. There is, sunlight, wind, water. There's all kinds of energy moving around here. And the same is true with wealth. Wealth isn't constrained. If it's allowed to free flow, it's everywhere.
Right. Yeah. So is it, I guess, one final question, then I'll let you kind of say anything else you'd like to say before we wrap this up. But is it really, in order to make this shift from this short-termism, this kind of me, at the expense of others kind of thinking that in some cases is out there, is it really on the businesses to take the leadership, as we talked about, and lead? And one, are they going to do that on their own will, or is it going to take an actual shift in policy, in your view, to change this or shift this?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I don't think that it's a single catalyst that's going to make things shift. I think it really is awareness. An increase in awareness increases my experience of choices available to me. So I think part of what happens is as people become more aware of some of the consequences of what's going on around them, they start making different choices. When we start voting with our dollars, we start voting with our pocketbooks as consumers. I also think that businesses, when they start becoming aware of the consequence of their activities, at a very literal level, they can begin to look at different ways that they can approach this. For me personally, I just led a program, and I think just led a program. I just launched a program in Asia that I called "Business as a Spiritual Discipline." Yeah, and I think that business, if it's approached from a perspective that I'm thinking of here, it is actually a spiritual educator. And I don't mean spirit in a religious sense. I mean spirit in the sense of it taps into, how do I be more fully alive? And that question, how do I be more fully alive? Business serves an incredibly important role in that process of allowing people to feel more alive. Both in the business itself, but also as a consequence of the business's activity. So if business leaders begin approaching what they do as a spiritual activity, not as a mercantile activity, not as as a business activity, but as a spiritual activity, it speaks to connection, it speaks to growth, it speaks to expansion, it speaks to aliveness. I mean, all of those sorts of things. Business is a spiritual activity or a spiritual discipline. Right. And the word discipline requires attention. Yeah, it requires people actually adhering to a set of standards, if you will. Making decisions that are in service of the greater good, not just in service of the business's benefit. Well, and you mitigate that. It's a 51-49% sort of a dynamic. The business needs to be viable, but it can't be viable at the expense of the rest of the ecosystem.
More of a stakeholder orientation, yeah. And keep up the good work and what you're doing, bringing awareness to this. Then, and as we wrap this up, any final statements you'd like to leave the listeners with, and where can they find out more about you and your work?
Great. Well, the last part of that first, BlaineBartlett.com, BlaineBartlett.com. I've got a podcast that's available on all of the podcast channels. The Soul of Business with Blaine Bartlett, so they can find out more information there. That's a bi-weekly podcast. So those would be the two major sources of information. And the last thing here is the idea that business is the most powerful influencer on the planet today. If I'm in business, whether as an owner or as a member of a business, which covers just about everybody, or as a consumer of business, pay attention to the impact that I'm having. Pay attention to the impact that we're generating out there. It can be positive, and positive not just in a monetary sense, but positive in a life-affirming, life-giving context. And if we're doing that, business will take responsibility for the future, because the future is its responsibility. And I just think that that's where we need to land.
I love that. I love that statement. The business it's the future. Say it one more time. The future.
Yeah, the future of business is making the future its business.
Yeah. There you go. It's kind of a tongue twister, but I like the saying. So
yeah.
All right, Blaine. Yeah. Thank you so much for stopping by and having the chat, and hope everybody enjoyed that discussion. Check out BlaineBartlett.com, and also check out the Soul of Business podcast. I'll link both of those resources up below this video. If you're listening to this on iTunes or Stitcher Radio, go over to BlaineBartlett.com and say hi to Blaine. And thanks so much for coming by, Blaine. Hope everybody enjoyed this discussion, and we'll talk to you on the next one. Take care.
John, thanks.